Malik's quiet life with his disabled daughter Amara is shattered when a routine traffic stop spirals into an act of violence by a racist police officer. Now, with the support of a witness and a determined lawyer, Malik faces a justice system built to protect his oppressor. Will they be able to expose the truth and hold those in power accountable, or will the system crush their fight for justice? Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. Malik's mornings always began the same way. He would wake up just before dawn, his mind already turning over the day's tasks as the city slept around him. Today was no different, except perhaps for the way the shadows played on the walls of his small apartment, a reminder of the cracks in both his life and the building that housed him. The worn-out radiator clanked as Malik moved around his cramped kitchen, preparing breakfast for himself and his daughter, Amara. Amara was still asleep, curled up beneath her purple blanket, her little form barely visible except for the occasional stir. Her wheelchair stood beside the bed, a constant presence in their lives, a symbol of both her resilience and the obstacles she faced every day. Malik often looked at her and marveled at how much strength such a small body could carry. She was only 8, yet her spirit was bright, defiant even, in the face of the physical limitations that shaped her existence. For Malik, every day felt like a balancing act. Between his job at the community center, where he worked with underprivileged kids, and raising Amara alone after her mother had passed away, he often wondered how he managed to hold everything together. Some days, it felt like he was just one wrong move away from everything falling apart. But every morning, when he saw Amara's face light up with her infectious smile, he remembered why he kept going. Today felt different, though. There was a strange heaviness in the air, a weight that seemed to press down on him as he moved through their usual morning routine. Malik couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he'd learned to trust his gut instincts. It wasn't paranoia, it was experience. Living as a black man in this world, he knew that life could change in an instant, often for the worse. You could be minding your own business one moment and find yourself in a situation you didn't see coming the next. As they sat down to breakfast, Amara was her usual chipper self, chattering about the day ahead, the new book they were reading together, and her excitement about visiting the grocery store later to pick up her favorite snack. Malik smiled as he listened, grateful for the simple joy she found in life despite her challenges. But his mind was elsewhere, running through the day's schedule and the uneasy feeling gnawing at him. On the surface, everything was normal. They had done this 1,000 times before. Get ready, drop Amara off at school, go to work, then pick her up and head home. But today, Malik couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to go wrong. As they left the apartment, Malik glanced up at the overcast sky. The air felt thick, as if the weather itself was on edge, waiting for something to happen. He shook his head, forcing himself to focus. He had to stay grounded for Amara's sake. Whatever came, he would handle it like he always had. They drove in silence for most of the way, the radio playing softly in the background. Malik couldn't help but notice how tired his old car sounded, its engine struggling with each mile. He made a mental note to take it to the mechanic, but money was tight, and he had to prioritize Amara's needs first. As they neared the grocery store, Amara's excitement grew, and she started talking about the book again, her little voice rising in pitch as she got more animated. Malik parked in their usual spot and began helping Amara out of the car and into her wheelchair. They were just about to head inside when a police cruiser pulled up beside them, the flash of lights catching Malik off guard. His heart sank instantly. Not today. Not with Amara here. The officer who stepped out of the car was tall, stocky, and had an air of authority that made Malik's stomach churn. He recognized him immediately, Officer Barnes. Malik had seen him around the neighborhood before, known for his tendency to target black men for no apparent reason. His reputation for unnecessary stops and aggressive behavior wasn't a secret, and Malik had always tried to stay off his radar. But here they were, face to face. "Hey, you!" Officer Barnes called out, his voice sharp, making Malik flinch involuntarily. Amara looked up at her father, confused, her eyes wide. Stay calm, Malik muttered under his breath, his hand tightening on the handle of Amara's wheelchair. He knew he had done nothing wrong, but that didn't matter. In situations like this, innocence didn't protect you. It could even make things worse. Can I help you, officer? Malik asked, keeping his voice as calm as he could, even though his pulse was racing. Barnes sauntered over, his hand resting on his belt. He didn't look at Malik right away. Instead, his eyes roamed over the car, then Amara, as if searching for something to justify his presence. Malik had seen that look before. Judgment without reason. License and registration, Barnes barked, his gaze finally meeting Malik's. There was a challenge in his eyes, daring Malik to question him. Malik could feel Amara tensing beside him, her small hand gripping the armrest of her wheelchair. He wanted to reassure her, tell her everything would be fine, but he didn't have the luxury of comforting words right now. The situation was too volatile. Sure, Malik said, reaching for his wallet. He moved slowly, deliberately, knowing any sudden movement could escalate things further. He handed Barnes the documents and waited, his heart pounding in his chest. Barnes took his time, looking over the papers as if he had all the time in the world. Malik could feel the tension building, the air growing thicker with each passing second. Where are you headed? Barnes finally asked, his tone casual, but with an edge that made Malik bristle. Just taking my daughter to the store, Malik replied, keeping his voice even. He knew better than to show any sign of frustration. Barnes nodded, though it was clear he wasn't really listening. He glanced at Amara again, his expression unreadable. Your daughter, huh? She doesn't look like she belongs here. The comment hit Malik like a punch to the gut. He clenched his jaw, fighting back the anger that surged through him. He knew exactly what Barnes was implying, and it took everything in him not to react. For Amara's sake, he had to stay calm. Amara looked up at Malik, confused. Daddy, why is he saying that? Malik bent down, his voice gentle as he whispered, Don't worry, sweetheart, everything's okay. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. Everything was about to change. The tension in the air grew thick, almost suffocating. Malik could feel his pulse throbbing in his temples as he tried to keep his composure. Officer Barnes was still looming over him, eyes narrowing, as if searching for something to justify the growing hostility. The bystanders in the parking lot began to take notice, some casting curious glances in their direction, while others tried to avoid the scene altogether, as if sensing the impending storm. Amara sat quietly in her wheelchair, her wide, innocent eyes darting between her father and the officer. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she could sense the unease in the air. The shift in her father's mood from calm to cautious. Malik had always taught her about being aware of her surroundings, about understanding when to stay quiet and let things play out, but she had never seen him this tense. Barnes flipped through Malik's documents as if he had all the time in the world. His casual disregard for the situation infuriated Malik, but he knew better than to react. Reacting could be dangerous. Reacting could mean a loss of control, and that was the last thing Malik could afford right now. I'm just doing my job, you understand, Barnes said in a tone that suggested anything but professionalism. Gotta make sure everyone around here is following the rules. And you? Well, you seem like the type who might not. The insinuation wasn't lost on Malik. He had heard these kinds of comments his whole life. He had seen the suspicion in people's eyes when they looked at him. A tall black man driving an old car and dressed simply because his money went to supporting his daughter, not himself. He had learned to live with the judgment. But this was different. This wasn't a passerby making a silent assumption. This was a man with authority and power, standing over him, looking for a reason to cause trouble. I've done nothing wrong, Malik said, his voice steady, though his hands trembled slightly as he gripped Amara's wheelchair. I'm just trying to take my daughter to the store. Barnes gave a half smirk, shaking his head as if amused by Malik's response. Yeah, well, we'll see about that. Amara, sensing the tension, turned to her father. Daddy, can we go home? I don't like this. Malik crouched beside her, his face softening as he met her worried gaze. We will, sweetheart. Just give me a moment, okay? As Malik stood, Barnes stepped closer, his body language aggressive. You got something to hide? The officer asked, his voice sharp. He hadn't even checked Malik's documents yet, but it was clear he wasn't interested in procedure. This was about control. "No, officer," Malik said, keeping his voice calm despite the anger roiling beneath his skin. "We're just here to shop. That's all." Barnes seemed to ignore Malik's words, his gaze sliding toward Amara. "Cute kid. Shame about the chair, though," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. Malik's jaw tightened. The casual cruelty in Barnes's words felt like a slap to the face. He glanced down at Amara, who was fidgeting with her hands, clearly uncomfortable. His protective instinct surged, but he fought to keep his temper in check. Reacting could escalate things, and he had to think of Amara. Barnes wasn't finished. He gestured toward Malik's car. "This piece of junk, even safe to drive, looks like it's falling apart. Probably a hazard to your daughter, don't you think?" Malik clenched his fists at his sides, feeling the slow burn of anger rising inside him. "The car's fine," he said, his voice tight. "I take good care of it." Sure, Barnes muttered, glancing over the car again with exaggerated disdain. He walked slowly around it, inspecting it as if it were some kind of threat, his hand never leaving his belt. It was clear he was stalling, dragging the situation out to assert his authority. Amara, growing more anxious, reached out for her father's hand. "Daddy, can we go now?" she whispered, her small voice filled with fear. Barnes noticed the interaction, and his face twisted into a sneer. "She seems a little nervous." "You teaching her to be scared of the police?" he asked, stepping forward again, this time close enough that Malik could smell the faint scent of coffee on his breath. Malik straightened, positioning himself slightly in front of Amara. His heart pounded in his chest, every instinct telling him to protect her. But he had to do it the right way. No sudden movements, no raised voices. "I'm teaching her to be careful," Malik replied, his voice level. "Because sometimes, things aren't always what they seem." Barnes' sneer deepened, and for a moment the parking lot seemed to freeze. Everything around them, the cars, the people, the noises, faded into the background as Malik and Barnes locked eyes, two men in a silent battle of wills. The tension was palpable, thick like a heavy fog that neither of them could escape. But it was Amara who broke the silence. "Why are you being mean to my daddy?" she asked softly, her voice trembling with confusion. Barnes' eyes flickered toward her, and something in his expression darkened. He took a step forward, but Malik quickly moved between them, his protective instinct kicking into overdrive. In that moment, Barnes snapped. His patience, if he had ever had any, evaporated. "Step out of the car." Barnes barked, his hand moving to grab Malik by the arm. Malik tensed, trying to stay calm, but the sudden aggression caught him off guard. "Hey, there's no need for this," he said, holding his hands up, palms open. "We've done nothing wrong." Barnes didn't care. His hand tightened around Malik's arm, and in the chaos of the moment, as Malik tried to free himself without resisting, Barnes lost his grip. The officer's frustration flared, and without warning he lashed out. The world seemed to slow down as Barnes's hand moved, but it wasn't Malik he struck. It was Amara. The blow was quick, an impulsive, uncontrolled swing that grazed her face and knocked her small body against the side of her wheelchair. The shock of the moment paralyzed everyone, Malik, Amara, the onlookers who had begun to gather nearby. Time itself seemed to hold its breath. For a split second, no one moved, no one breathed. Then the silence shattered. Amara let out a small, sharp cry, her hands flying to her face as tears welled up in her eyes. Malik, frozen in disbelief, could only stare as his brain struggled to comprehend what had just happened. The world around him blurred, his vision narrowing as rage, sorrow, and helplessness collided inside him. "You," Malik began, but the words died in his throat. Before he could react further, a voice from behind him cut through the chaos. "Hey. I saw everything." It was a woman, standing at the edge of the parking lot with her phone raised, recording the entire incident. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock and determination. She had seen what happened, and she wasn't going to stay silent. Barnes, suddenly aware of the crowd and the phone pointed in his direction, froze. The color drained from his face as the realization of what he had done sank in. Malik, trembling with fury and disbelief, knelt beside Amara, cradling her small, trembling form as she sobbed quietly. His heart shattered at the sight of her pain. But as he held her, his mind was already shifting. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The crowd began to murmur, whispers of disbelief and outrage rippling through the air. Barnes, still standing there with his hand hovering near his belt, was no longer in control of the situation. The power had shifted, and he knew it. The woman with the phone stepped closer. "I've got this all on video," she said, her voice steady, though her hands were shaking. "You're not getting away with this." Malik looked up at her, tears stinging his eyes as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. He wanted to thank her, but no words came. All he could do was hold Amara, trying to comfort her while the world around them continued to spin out of control. The ripple of that single, careless act was only just beginning. The hospital room was small, sterile, and silent, except for the rhythmic beeping of machines monitoring Amara's vital signs. Malik sat beside her bed, his hand gently resting on hers, feeling the steady warmth of her skin. He could barely bring himself to look at her, not because he didn't want to, because every time he did, he felt the crushing weight of guilt slam into him like a tidal wave. Her small face was still swollen from where Barnes had struck her, a bruise forming along her cheekbone. A cruel reminder of the nightmare that had unfolded only hours before. Amara was sleeping now, her breathing shallow but even. Malik could still hear the echo of her soft, heart-wrenching sobs from earlier as the doctors checked her over. She'd been so brave, even in the midst of her pain, trying to hold it together for him. And what had he done? He had failed her. He hadn't been able to protect his own daughter when she needed him the most. Malik rubbed his eyes, his exhaustion seeping into his bones. He hadn't slept, and he doubted he could even if he tried. His mind was still racing, still replaying every second of the incident in vivid detail. The way Barnes had looked at him, the simmering hatred barely hidden behind that badge. The way he had stepped forward with such casual cruelty, as though Amara was nothing more than an obstacle in his way. And then that single, devastating moment when he'd struck her. Malik's fists tightened at the memory, the anger that had been brewing inside him since the beginning of the encounter now burning hotter than ever. But anger wasn't enough. Not now, not anymore. He needed to do something, anything, to make this right. Amara's face flashed before him again, her tears, her confusion, her pain. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about her. She was the one who had been hurt. She was the one whose innocence had been shattered in the cruelest of ways. Malik's phone buzzed on the table beside him, breaking the silence. He picked it up, seeing Jenny's name flash across the screen. His best friend? His confidant, and the only person he could trust with something this heavy. He answered it quietly, not wanting to disturb Amara. "Malik?" Jenny's voice was soft but urgent, full of the same worry he felt. "How's Amara? Is she okay?" She'll be fine," Malik replied, though his voice was thick with emotion. "Physically, at least. But I don't know, Jenny. I don't know how to make this right." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Malik could picture Jenny sitting at her desk, probably running her fingers through her short curls as she always did when she was deep in thought. She was a brilliant lawyer, known for taking on civil rights cases, but even she knew this wasn't just about the law. This was about something bigger, something uglier, and something far more personal. "We have to fight this, Malik," Jenny said finally, her voice firm. "You can't let him get away with this, you know that, right?" Malik sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I know, Jenny, I know. But it's not that simple. You know how these things go. They'll twist it around, make it seem like it was my fault, or worse, make it seem like Amara somehow provoked him. And Barnes, he's a cop. They'll protect him." "Not this time," Jenny insisted. "Not with the video. That woman, Linda, she recorded everything to that. That's our leverage." Linda? Malik hadn't even had a chance to properly thank her. She had been a silent witness to the worst moment of his life, but in that moment, she had become something more. A beacon of hope. A chance to seek justice in a world that so often refused it. But as much as Malik wanted to believe Jenny's optimism, a part of him remained skeptical. He had seen how the system worked. He had seen it up close and personal. Time and time again. "What if it's not enough?" Malik asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What if it doesn't change anything? I can't put Amara through more trauma, Jenny. I just can't." Jenny's voice softened. "I get it, Malik. I really do. But think about what it means if you don't fight back. What message does that send to Amara? To every other kid out there who looks like her? Barnes didn't just hurt Amara, he's part of a system that hurts kids like her every day. You've got to stand up for her, for all of them. Malik closed his eyes, the weight of Jenny's words sinking in. She was right, of course. He knew she was right. But knowing it and acting on it were two different things. The thought of standing up against someone like Barnes, against the police force itself, filled him with dread. The system wasn't designed for people like him. It was designed to crush people like him. "I'll talk to Linda," Malik said finally. After what felt like an eternity of silence, "I'll see if she's willing to come forward with the footage. But I don't want Amara to be dragged through this. She's been through enough." "I understand," Jenny said gently. "Just know that whatever you decide, I'm here for you. We'll get through this, one way or another." Malik hung up, staring at his phone for a long moment before setting it down again. The fight was just beginning, and he wasn't sure if he had the strength for it. But he didn't have a choice, did he? Not anymore. Hours passed in the quiet of the hospital room, the steady beeping of the machines lulling Malik into a strange state of calm. He watched over Amara as she slept, his thoughts swirling in a chaotic whirl of guilt, anger, and fear. What was he supposed to do now? How could he shield her from the world when it had already shown her its worst? The door to the room opened slowly, and Malik looked up to see a woman standing there. It was Linda, the woman who had recorded everything. She looked nervous, her eyes darting around the room as if she wasn't sure if she should even be there. But when she saw Malik, she gave a small, apologetic smile and stepped inside. "Hi," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to intrude, but I wanted to check on your daughter. Is she okay?" Malik nodded, grateful for her presence, even though it felt strange to see her outside the context of the parking lot. "She's going to be okay. Thank you for what you did back there. I don't know if I've said that yet." Linda shook her head. "You don't have to thank me. I couldn't stand by and watch that happen. It wasn't right. What that officer did, it wasn't right." Malik's throat tightened. "No, it wasn't. But now, I don't know what to do. How do I protect her from something like this happening again?" Linda stepped closer, her expression somber. "You fight back," she said softly. "You make sure they can't do this to anyone else. That's why I recorded it. That's why I'm here. I want to help." Her words, though simple, were a lifeline. Malik had felt so alone in all of this, so overwhelmed by the weight of the injustice, that he hadn't realized how many others were willing to stand by his side. "I'm scared," Malik admitted, his voice barely audible. "I'm scared for her." Linda nodded, her eyes filled with empathy. "I know, but you're not alone." The words hung in the air, offering Malik the first real sense of hope he had felt since the incident. Maybe, just maybe, they could get through this. Maybe justice wasn't so far out of reach after all. Malik looked down at Amara, her small hand still nestled in his. For her, he would fight. For her, he would do whatever it took to make sure the world saw what happened to her, and that it would never happen to another child again. The days following the incident blurred together into a haze of hospital visits, lawyer meetings, and sleepless nights. Malik had been running on pure adrenaline, his mind constantly spinning with what lay ahead. Amara had been released from the hospital, physically on the mend, but emotionally still raw. The bruises on her face would fade, but Malik knew the deeper wounds, the ones you couldn't see, would take much longer to heal. The first meeting with Jenny at her office felt like the first step in what Malik already knew would be an exhausting journey. Her office, filled with stacks of case files and awards for civil rights work, seemed like a place where battles were won, but this wasn't just any battle. This was a fight against a system that had been built to protect people like Officer Barnes, not people like Malik and Amara. Jenny greeted him with a firm handshake, her face serious but kind. "I'm glad you're here," she said as she led him into her office. "We've got a lot to go over, but I'm with you every step of the way." Malik appreciated Jenny's confidence, but the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on him, heavy and unrelenting. He sat down across from her, his hands gripping his knees. He wasn't sure where to begin, but Jenny didn't wait for him to speak. "Linda sent me the video," she said, her voice steady as she opened her laptop. "It's solid evidence. There's no way they can argue their way out of this. Officer Barnes clearly crossed a line, hun. What he did to Amara was unacceptable, and with this footage, we have the leverage we need. Malik felt a surge of both relief and anxiety. The video. It was both a blessing and a curse. It was their ticket to justice, but it was also the most vulnerable moment of his life captured for the world to see. Amara's pain, his helplessness, all of it was there, immortalized in pixels. Jenny must have sensed his hesitation. I know it's hard, she said softly, leaning forward. But this is how we hold them accountable. You and Amara deserve justice, Malik. And with this evidence, we have a real shot. Malik nodded, his throat tight. He wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that the system would work this time. But after everything he'd seen, after everything he'd lived, trust wasn't something that came easily. What happens next? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We'll file a formal complaint with the police department, Jenny explained. That will trigger an internal investigation. But I want to be clear, this isn't going to be easy. The department will likely try to protect Barnes. They might try to discredit you, claim you were uncooperative, that you provoked the situation. They'll say whatever they need to say to protect him. Malik's heart sank. He had expected this, but hearing it said out loud made it feel all the more real. So, they'll try to make it look like it's my fault, he said bitterly. Jenny nodded. That's a real possibility. But we're not going to let them get away with it. That's why the video is so important. It's hard evidence that shows exactly what happened. And we have Linda as a witness, which strengthens our case. Malik exhaled slowly, the weight of it all pressing down on him like a ton of bricks. The fight hadn't even started yet, and already it felt like he was losing. But then he thought of Amara, the fear in her eyes that day, and the pain she had endured. This wasn't just about him. This was about her. About protecting her and making sure she knew that what happened to her was wrong. I'll do it, Malik said finally, his voice resolute. Whatever it takes, I want to fight. Jenny smiled, a glint of determination in her eyes. Good, because this is going to be a battle, but we're going to fight it together. The days that followed were filled with paperwork and preparations. Jenny filed the formal complaint, and as expected, the police department launched an internal investigation. Malik knew the investigation was little more than a formality, a box they would check off before inevitably siding with Barnes. But that wasn't the endgame. The real fight would come later, in court, where they could present the video and make sure the truth came out. Malik spent every waking moment either with Amara or preparing for the legal battle. Amara, for her part, was quieter than usual. She had always been such a bright, talkative child, but ever since the incident, she had retreated into herself. Malik noticed the way she avoided looking in mirrors, the way she tensed up whenever they passed a police car on the street. It broke his heart to see her like this, to know that her world had been forever changed by a moment of senseless cruelty. One evening, as they sat together on the couch watching her favorite cartoons, Amara finally spoke. Daddy, she said quietly, her eyes never leaving the screen. Why did that man hurt me? Malik felt his heart clench. He had been dreading this question, knowing there was no easy answer. How could he explain something so incomprehensible to an 8-year-old? How could he make her understand the ugliness of the world without breaking her spirit? I don't know, sweetheart, he said softly, brushing a curl away from her face. Sometimes people do bad things because they're scared or angry. But what he did was wrong, and we're going to make sure everyone knows that. Amara was quiet for a moment, her little hands gripping the edge of her blanket. Are you scared, Daddy? Malik swallowed the lump in his throat. A little, he admitted. But I'm also brave, just like you are. She looked up at him then, her big eyes searching his face. I don't feel brave. Malik smiled gently, pulling her into a hug. You are, though. Being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you keep going, even when you are. Amara rested her head against his chest, her small body relaxing into his embrace. I want to be brave like you. Malik held her close, his heart aching with both love and sorrow. You already are. Weeks passed, and the pressure mounted. The police department's internal investigation was predictably slow, and Malik's anxiety grew with each passing day. Every time his phone rang, his heart jumped, fearing bad news. But Jenny remained steadfast, guiding him through each step of the process, reassuring him that they were doing everything they could. Then, one afternoon, Malik received a call from Jenny that changed everything. "Malik," she said, her voice laced with urgency, "we've got a problem. The department is pushing back. They're saying that Barnes acted within protocol, that he felt threatened, and that's why he reacted the way he did." Malik's stomach twisted. "Threatened? By an 8-year-old girl in a wheelchair?" "I know," Jenny said, frustration clear in her voice. "It's absurd. But they're trying to build a narrative that paints you as aggressive, that you resisted, and that Barnes had no choice but to defend himself." Malik's hands clenched into fists. "They're lying." "I know," Jenny said. "But this is how they operate. They'll twist the story to protect him. That's why we need to be ready to fight this in court. They might try to drag it out, hope that we'll back down, but we can't. We won't." Malik's anger simmered just beneath the surface. He had expected this, but hearing it confirmed was infuriating. The injustice of it all, the way they could so easily twist the truth to protect one of their own, was enough to make his blood boil. "We won't back down," Malik said firmly. "I won't let them get away with this." Jenny's voice softened. "I know it's hard, Malik, but you're doing the right thing. We're going to get through this. Just hang in there." As the legal proceedings moved forward, the case began to attract media attention. Local reporters picked up on the story, and soon it was being discussed on news stations, with pundits weighing in on the issue of racial profiling and police misconduct. Malik had never wanted this kind of attention. He had never wanted to be in the spotlight, but now there was no turning back. One evening, as Malik was sitting with Amara, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was an article about the case, detailing the upcoming court date and highlighting the controversy surrounding Officer Barnes. The headline read, "Father seeks justice after officer strikes disabled daughter, racial profiling or self-defense." Malik stared at the headline, the word self-defense sending a fresh wave of anger through him. There was no defense for what Barnes had done. And soon everyone would see that. The fight was far from over, but Malik was ready, for Amara, for himself, for everyone who had ever been wronged by a system designed to protect those in power. He was ready to fight, and this time he wasn't fighting alone. The courtroom was cold and sterile, the kind of place where life-changing events seemed almost insignificant, reduced to paperwork and legal jargon. Malik sat at the plaintiff's table, his fingers gripping the edge of the smooth wooden surface as he tried to steady his nerves. To his left, Jenny flipped through her notes, her expression calm and focused. She had prepared for this moment meticulously, but no amount of preparation could ease the knot tightening in Malik's stomach. Across the room, Officer Barnes sat beside his defense attorney, his face impassive, almost smug. Malik could barely stand to look at him, the man who had shattered his world with a single impulsive act. Barnes had become a symbol of everything Malik had come to fear. The cold indifference of power, the ease with which a life could be altered forever by someone else's prejudice. The courtroom filled slowly, the murmur of voices growing louder as more people filtered in. Malik noticed a few familiar faces from the community, people who had come to support him. But he also saw the harsh stares of those who had sided with Barnes, convinced that the officer had done nothing wrong. The case had stirred up deep tensions, the kind that had always simmered beneath the surface, but now they were laid bare for all to see. Amara sat in the front row, her small frame dwarfed by the hard wooden bench. She was quiet, her wide eyes taking in everything around her. Malik hadn't wanted her to come to court, but Jenny had insisted it would be important for the jury to see her, to see the real, human consequences of Barnes' actions. Still, it pained him to have her here, exposed to the harsh reality of the situation. But Amara had been determined. She wanted to be brave, just like her father. The judge entered, and everyone rose to their feet as the trial officially began. Malik felt his pulse quicken as the proceedings started, the opening statements washing over him in a blur of legal terminology and rhetoric. Jenny's voice was calm and measured as she laid out their case, focusing on the video footage, the witness statements, and the undeniable fact that Barnes had acted recklessly. She spoke with conviction, painting a picture of the harm that had been done to Amara, both physically and emotionally. The defense attorney, however, was slick and practiced. He framed Barnes as an officer under pressure, a man who had been forced to make a split-second decision in what he claimed was a tense and potentially dangerous situation. He spoke about Malik's uncooperative behavior, twisting the events to make it seem as though Barnes had been provoked. Malik clenched his fists as he listened, the anger simmering beneath his skin. It was hard to sit there, powerless, as his actions were distorted and spun into something they weren't. But the worst part came when Barnes himself took the stand. He spoke confidently, his voice steady as he recounted the incident from his perspective. He described Malik as a belligerent, refusing to comply with his orders. He claimed that he had been forced to act in defense of himself and the community, insinuating that Malik had posed a threat. It was a narrative designed to manipulate, to play into the fears that some people still held about men who looked like Malik. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," Barnes said, his tone measured and calm. "But when you're in a situation where you believe someone might become violent, you have to act. I did what I thought was necessary to protect myself and others." Malik could barely contain his outrage. Protect himself? From what? An 8-year-old girl in a wheelchair? Jenny, sensing Malik's growing frustration, placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "We'll tear his story apart," she whispered. "Stay calm. We've got this." When it was Jenny's turn to cross-examine Barnes, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. Jenny was sharp and unrelenting, her questions cutting through Barnes's carefully constructed narrative with precision. "You say you felt threatened," Jenny began, her voice crisp. "Can you explain how an 8-year-old child in a wheelchair, sitting silently in the car, posed a threat to you?" Barnes hesitated for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for everyone in the courtroom to notice. "It wasn't the child I felt threatened by," he said, choosing his words carefully. "It was her father's behavior." Jenny didn't let up. Her father, who, according to the video footage, was standing still with his hands raised? How exactly did that make you feel threatened? Barnes shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but his expression remained stony. "It's easy to look back now and say that, but in the heat of the moment, you don't always know what someone is capable of." Jenny's voice took on a harder edge. "So you're saying you made a decision based on assumptions? Assumptions that led to you striking a defenseless child?" Barnes opened his mouth to respond, but Jenny didn't give him the chance. "The fact is, Officer Barnes, you made a snap judgment based on prejudice. You saw a black man standing with his daughter, and you assumed he was a threat. You escalated the situation without cause, and in the process, you harmed an innocent child." There was a murmur in the courtroom, the tension palpable. Jenny let the silence hang for a moment before continuing. "Tell me, Officer Barnes, if Malik had been a white man standing there with his daughter, would you have reacted the same way?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. Barnes's face flushed slightly, but he didn't answer. He couldn't. The silence spoke volumes. As the trial continued, it became clear that the tide was turning. The video footage was damning, and Linda's testimony as a witness only strengthened their case. She described what she had seen in vivid detail, her voice steady as she recounted the fear and confusion in Amara's eyes when Barnes had struck her. It was hard to listen to, but it was necessary. The truth needed to be heard, no matter how painful. The defense continued to push their narrative, but it was becoming harder and harder to believe. Even the jurors, who had initially seemed indifferent, were starting to look at Barnes with skepticism. The cracks in his story were showing, and Jenny was relentless in her pursuit of the truth. Finally, the day came when Malik took the stand. He had dreaded this moment. Reliving the events of that day was something he had tried to push from his mind. But now, he had no choice but to face it head-on. He took a deep breath as he sat down, his eyes briefly meeting Amara's in the front row. She gave him a small, encouraging smile, and that was all he needed to steady himself. Jenny guided him through his testimony, her questions gentle but direct. Malik spoke about what had happened that day, the confusion, the fear, and the helplessness he had felt as the situation spiraled out of control. He spoke about his love for Amara, how every decision he made was with her safety in mind. And then he spoke about the moment when Barnes had struck her. I've never felt more powerless in my life, Malik said, his voice thick with emotion. Seeing my daughter, my little girl, hurt like that, there are no words to describe the pain. I couldn't protect her, and that's something I have to live with every day. The courtroom was silent as Malik continued. But this isn't just about what happened to us. This is about a pattern of behavior, a system that allows officers like Barnes to act with impunity. We're here today because we want accountability. We want justice, not just for Amara, but for everyone who has ever been harmed by the system that's supposed to protect them. When Malik finished speaking, there wasn't a sound in the courtroom. Even the defense attorney seemed at a loss for words. The jury deliberated for hours, each passing minute feeling like an eternity for Malik. He sat with Amara in the hallway outside the courtroom, holding her hand and trying to keep her spirits up. Jenny paced back and forth, her face tight with concentration. She had done everything she could, and now all they could do was wait. Finally, the courtroom doors opened, and the jurors filed back in. Malik's heart pounded in his chest as he followed them, taking his seat beside Jenny. The judge asked for the verdict, and the room held its breath. The jury foreperson stood, her voice steady as she spoke. We find the defendant, Officer Richard Barnes, guilty of assault and misconduct. A collective sigh of relief swept through the courtroom, and Malik felt his entire body sag with the weight of it. He glanced down at Amara, who was beaming up at him, her eyes shining with pride. They had done it. In the weeks that followed, the media coverage of the case continued, but for Malik, the victory wasn't about the headlines. It was about the message they had sent. Barnes had been held accountable, and that was a win not just for Malik and Amara, but for everyone who had ever been a victim of injustice. It wasn't a perfect system, but this time the truth had prevailed. One evening, as Malik and Amara sat together on the porch of their small apartment, watching the sun set over the horizon, Amara spoke quietly. "Daddy, are we safe now?" Malik looked down at her, his heart swelling with both love and sadness. He wished he could promise her that nothing like this would ever happen again. But he knew the world didn't work that way. The fight for justice was never really over. "We're safer," Malik said softly, pulling her close. "And we're stronger. That's what matters." Amara rested her head on his shoulder, her small body warm against his. "You were brave," she whispered. Malik smiled, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "So were you." As the sky darkened and the stars began to twinkle overhead, Malik closed his eyes, feeling a sense of peace for the first time in what felt like forever. The road ahead would be long, and there would be more battles to fight. But for now, in this moment, they had won. And that was enough. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.